Saipan, Mariana Islands, July 7th, 1944. 04:15 hours. The sky was still black, but the jungle wasn't quiet. First came the chanting, thousands of voices rising from the cane fields. It started as a low rumble, then swelled into a rolling roar that shivered through the palms. Along the marine perimeter, cigarette tips glowed for the last time, before the word passed down. Guns ready. In a shallow pit, a two-man crew crouched behind a weapon that looked like it belonged to another war. The Browning M1917, water-cooled, heavy, slow to move. A relic of 1918. But as the first shapes broke from the darkness, it came alive. Steam hissed from the water jacket. The belt clattered through. The barrel did not overheat. The line did not break. By dawn, 4,000 Japanese soldiers lay still across a single coral plain. The largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War, crushed in minutes by what many had called obsolete. The question echoed through the ranks, and later through history itself. Why were outdated World War I guns the perfect answer to Japan's deadliest tactic? And, to understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the Pacific Islands burned under naval bombardment, the United States Marine Corps was already a service defined by austerity and improvisation. In 1940, its total manpower was smaller than many European divisions. The Marines were a tight, professional force, trained for expeditionary raids and small wars rather than continent-spanning campaigns. They had learned in Haiti, Nicaragua, and China that success came not from the newest weapons, but from organization, discipline, and adaptability. When America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, the Corps faced the vast Pacific with limited tools. The U.S. Army would receive the bulk of industrial production: tanks, new rifles, trucks. The Marines, fighting for funding and transport priority, had to make do with whatever could cross the ocean. That often meant weapons with long service histories. One of these was the Browning M1917 water-cooled machine gun, a beast of steel, hoses, and condensation, weighing more than 80 pounds when fully equipped. Designed in the trenches of France, it was meant to hold fixed lines indefinitely. It could fire for hours, the barrel bathed in boiling water, the hiss of steam as constant as breath. While the rest of the world chased lighter, air-cooled guns, the Marines saw a different value. They knew that islands in the Pacific would demand endurance, not portability. The early campaigns confirmed it. On Guadalcanal in 1942, the Corps found itself in a war of exhaustion. Supply convoys were often cut off. Ammunition and replacement parts trickled in through enemy fire. Night after night, Japanese infiltrators slipped through the jungle testing perimeters, probing for weak spots. When the attacks came, they came in waves, not cautious patrols, but furious, suicidal rushes. The Marines learned fast that mobility meant little when the fight came to your foxhole. They dug in, mapped fields of fire, and turned every hill and ridge into a fortress. Air-cooled guns like the M1919A4 were lighter. Yes, but they overheated after a few hundred rounds. The M1917s, meanwhile, could keep firing as long as belts and water lasted. Their crews became the anchors of every defensive line. Support weapons followed the same philosophy. The Browning automatic rifle, itself a veteran of 1918, was prized for reliability and immediate firepower in close combat. Springfield M1903 rifles equipped with rifle grenades filled gaps where mortars couldn't. 37mm anti-tank guns were repurposed to fire canister shot against infantry, shredding anything within 50 yards. Trench shotguns returned from storage, their short barrels ideal for jungle and cave fighting. These were not the arms of a modern mechanized war, but they were weapons the Marines could maintain under any condition: rain, mud, heat, or isolation. In the crucible of Guadalcanal, the Corps rediscovered something the First World War had already proven. The side that can sustain fire the longest often survives. From that point forward, Marine defensive doctrine began to crystallize. Each position was organized around interlocking machine gun sectors. Range cards, pre-measured by day, guided the gunners at night. Ammo bearers knew exactly how many belts each gun could expend before a barrel change or water refill. Perimeters were layered, overlapping, calculated to funnel attackers into kill zones covered by automatic fire. The experience spread quickly. When the Marines landed on Tarawa in 1943, and later Saipan, they brought those same principles. Every foxhole, every ridge, every coconut log bunker was designed with one purpose: to sustain fire without collapse. But to truly understand why such old equipment dominated the Pacific battlefield, one must also understand the opponent's mindset. The doctrine that compelled thousands of Japanese soldiers to charge into those cones of fire, again and again, even when the outcome was certain. To the Imperial Japanese Army, surrender was not a military decision. It was a moral failure. From the first campaigns in China through the island defenses of 1944, their doctrine prized spiritual will above material means. The idea of Gyokusai, to shatter like a jewel, taught that dying in honorable combat preserved the soul and the nation's dignity. To die charging an enemy line was not defeat, it was transcendence. In practice, this belief fused with tactical habits born from earlier successes. Against poorly equipped Chinese forces, human wave attacks had often broken defenses by shock alone. The bayonet charge, delivered at night or under smoke, was as much psychological warfare as physical assault. When carried into the Pacific against the United States Marines, it collided headlong with industrial firepower and disciplined fields of fire. The terrain shaped this confrontation. The Pacific Islands were rarely large enough for maneuver warfare. Coral ridges, ravines, and thick undergrowth funneled soldiers into narrow paths. Visibility rarely exceeded 30 yards. A frontal charge, once committed, had no room to disperse or withdraw. For the Japanese, these islands became final redoubts, places to fight to the last man. For the Marines, each landing was a siege in miniature, where endurance replaced mobility, and the night belonged to whoever could keep firing. In this environment, newer weapons often failed where older designs endured. The air-cooled Browning M1919A4 was lighter and easier to deploy, but under prolonged bursts, it overheated. Changing barrels under fire meant losing seconds that decided lives. The M19-117, though cumbersome, could run almost indefinitely, as long as water boiled and belts fed. A single gun could hold a 600-yard sector without pause. Marines improvised water supplies with canteens, coffee pots, even mud puddles, refilling jackets as steam clouded the foxholes. This contrast wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. The United States was discovering that technology alone did not win wars. Application and adaptation did. When naval bombardments failed to eliminate defenders hiding in coral caves, it was the infantry and their obsolete weapons that finished the job. The M19-17, the bar, the Springfield rifle, the 37mm gun, and the trench shotgun, each had a place in the puzzle, each a role that no sleek new prototype could yet replace. The Japanese, meanwhile, reinforced their belief that courage could overcome firepower. After each failed assault, surviving officers reported partial successes and vowed renewed attacks. On Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Bougainville, and Saipan, this cycle repeated with tragic consistency. At night, drums beat, bugles wailed, and hundreds, sometimes thousands, of soldiers rose from the brush in a collective charge. For the Marines on the line, it was a nightmare rhythm. The growing chant, the whistle of grenades, The first muzzle flashes, and then the roar of the guns. Marines countered not with mobility, but with calculation. Rangefinders, pre-registered defensive lines, and overlapping zones of fire transformed every gun position into part of a living grid. Machine guns were paired, one firing while the other cooled or reloaded. Riflemen filled the gaps between the cones of grazing fire. Mortars and 30mm guns covered dead zones where elevation broke line of sight. By late 1943, these defensive systems had matured into doctrine. Manuals circulated on how to construct final protective fires, coordinated walls of bullets and shells unleashed when an enemy broke through outer perimeters. Commanders taught their men that in the Pacific, fire superiority was the truest form of courage. To hold your trigger, to keep your gun alive while the world shook around you, was valor measured in discipline. The paradox was clear. The Japanese charged with faith in the future. The Marines held with tools of the past. And yet, time and again, it was the older technology, heavy, deliberate, water-hissing and belt-fed, that dictated who saw the sun rise. It was here, amid the mud and coral, that the story of the outdated guns became more than logistics. It became a study in endurance, engineering, and the human cost of belief colliding with physics. And that brings us to the many angles of this strange equation, where tactics, machines, and men all met at the limits of what they could sustain. Angle A, tactical, every Marine defense in the Central Pacific was geometry under fire. Each foxhole, trench, and gun pit fit into a pre-drawn map of arcs and overlap. The M1917 was the centerpiece of this equation. Its tripod anchored the sector, its belt stretched across sandbags, and its line of grazing fire was measured to hit a man's knees at 200 yards. When night fell, those ranges became invisible math guiding the defense. Each gun crew knew its final protective line, the moment when all safety cleared and the entire perimeter fired simultaneously. The Japanese called it hellfire. To the Marines, it was discipline turned to survival. The machine guns spoke in steady rhythm, not panic. Every burst was counted, each gunner alternating between short 5-round cuts and minute long streams when the wave came too close. Fields overlapped so tightly that a charging soldier could not cross 10 yards without entering a cone of bullets from at least 2 directions. The tactical doctrine was born from the lessons of Belleau Wood and refined under jungle canopies. There, visibility vanished, radios failed, and all that held the line were pre-arranged arcs and faith in the gun next to you. Angle B, technological to outsiders. The M1917 looked prehistoric. Water-jacketed, hose-fed, cumbersome. But physics favored it. Its water cooling system absorbed heat that would melt barrels on lighter guns. It could deliver 450 to 600 rounds per minute, sustained for hours. In the Pacific, where firefights often lasted through the night, this reliability was priceless. The crew filled the jacket with anything they could find: canteen water, coconut juice, muddy puddles. Steam vented through improvised hoses, condensing into empty ration tins so that not a drop was wasted. Even when the barrel glowed faintly red, the weapon stayed true. A well-placed M1917 could maintain a wall of fire longer than any automatic weapon of its time, and longer than any charging force could survive. Other obsolete weapons carried the same quiet logic. The 37mm gun, dismissed as underpowered against tanks, became a devastating anti-personnel tool when loaded with canister rounds, each shell turning into a storm of steel balls. The M1903 rifle, nearly half a century old by Saipan, proved precise and rugged in salt and humidity. In the Pacific, reliability was modernization. Angle C, human behind every weapon, was a small, synchronized team. The machine gun crew. The gunner aimed. The assistant fed the belt, swapped barrels, or topped up water. Two more Marines, the ammo carriers, crawled between pits, with belts slung around their necks like heavy scarves. Each knew the sound of a gun running dry, the abrupt stutter that meant reload or death. In those seconds, calm meant everything. Veterans recalled how the best gunners never raised their voices. Orders were hand signals, a tap on the shoulder to shift fire, a gesture for belt change, a silent nod toward an empty water can. Under flares and tracers, sweat mixed with steam. The smell was burnt oil and coral dust. When attacks broke, these crews became the immovable points around which platoons reformed. Riflemen gravitated to their positions, trusting that the guns would keep breathing. The M19-117's pulse, steady, deliberate, was the heartbeat of the perimeter. It wasn't heroism in the cinematic sense. It was endurance, repetition, precision under exhaustion. For many Marines, the war narrowed to that rhythm. Feed, fire, cool, reload, feed again. The old guns had proved their worth in metal and discipline. But beyond the trenches and foxholes lay the broader framework. Command, logistics, and leadership decisions that made this system sustainable. Across hundreds of miles of ocean, those would define how the next great charges were met, and why the Japanese soldiers running toward Marine lines were often running into a plan drawn days before they arrived. Angle D, leadership and logistics. No matter how heavy or old the weapon, it was leadership that made it decisive. From platoon leaders to battalion commanders, every Marine officer in the Pacific learned that logistics was not about supply chains. It was about seconds. A machine gun without belts was just a metal tripod. A water-cooled gun without coolant was a glowing liability. In preparation for island battles, Marine engineers developed pre-registration maps showing every defensive line's firing arcs and range markers. Company commanders walked the lines by daylight, noting landmarks, palm trunks, shell holes, coral ridges, to use as range references in the dark. Spare barrels, headspace gauges, and oil were packed in waterproof tins. Water cans were pre-filled and cached in foxholes every 20 yards. Every man knew which ammo dump he was responsible for replenishing. During night actions, runners crawled forward under fire, dragging fresh belts and 5-gallon cans. Each resupply trip was planned as precisely as artillery fire. That coordination, not technology, kept the guns alive through hours of attack. Commanders understood the math of endurance. Rate of fire X belts per hour, X hours before dawn. Survival depended on staying ahead of that equation. The success of obsolete weapons was, in truth, a triumph of system over circumstance. Angle E. Enemy and moral angle. For the Japanese infantrymen, the charge was more than a tactic. It was identity. Trained from youth to equate surrender with shame, soldiers were taught that a final assault could redeem failure and serve the emperor directly. When bugles sounded and officers drew swords, thousands rose as one body, often without artillery or coordination. Many carried only grenades or bayonets. What met them was not hatred but inevitability. Marine gunners described the sound as a tearing fabric of metal and voices. The M19-117's steady clatter drowned the shouts. 37mm canister rounds exploded into clouds of whirling steel. The first ranks disappeared. The second stumbled over them. In minutes, momentum turned to slaughter. To those behind the guns, the aftermath was not triumph. Marines often found themselves walking through fields of silence, where discipline had become devastation. Letters home rarely mentioned the details. Even General Holland Smith, commanding on Saipan, called the sight the most ghastly I have ever seen. Yet tactically, the outcome was final. The myth of the unstoppable charge had met the reality of sustained, deliberate fire. After Saipan, Japanese commanders abandoned mass Banzai attacks entirely. Courage had met chemistry, and chemistry had won. What began as a story about old guns was, in truth, a collision of doctrines: spirit versus calculation, sacrifice versus survival. But nowhere was that collision more vivid than in the battles themselves, where every second, every belt, every drop of water decided history. And for that, we turn to the turning points, the moments when those principles were tested to their limits and proved unbreakable. The ridge was just a rise of coral and clay, narrow, steep, and half-cleared of jungle. But to the Marines defending Henderson Field, it was the front door to the only airstrip between Australia and Midway. Lose the ridge, lose the island, and the line across the Pacific collapses. As night fell on September 12th, Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson's Raiders, and the Paramarines took their positions. There were barely 800 of them. Across the river, nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers from the Kawaguchi Brigade prepared to attack. They moved silently through the trees, guided by jungle trails and the promise of glory. They believed the Marines would break before dawn. At 21:30, the jungle erupted. Bugles wailed, mortars thumped, and machine guns opened like thunder rolling across the ridge. The first wave smashed into the forward companies, bayonets flashing under flares. Marines fell back in small groups, firing short, controlled bursts as they withdrew toward the final line atop the ridge. Behind them, in shallow pits dug hours earlier, the M1917 machine guns waited. Their tripods were sunk deep for stability. Water cans were filled, belts were linked together. 200 rounds, then another, and another. When the order came, "Final protective line, fire!" the ridge lit up like a storm. The guns spoke in rhythm, low and mechanical. Steam hissed in the darkness as water boiled off. The air was thick with smoke and burning vegetation. Gunners fired until the barrels glowed, then swapped them out and kept going. Marines shouted range adjustments, tracers streaked, and grenades arced down the slope. The Japanese kept coming. Entire platoons ran into the wall of fire, breaking apart under the steady clatter of Brownings and bars. 37 guns joined in, their canister rounds exploding into whirling clouds of shrapnel. Men described seeing entire sections of grass flatten as if a scythe had passed through. By Otulao, the line was nearly overrun. The Japanese broke through in several places, but Edson himself moved among the foxholes, rallying his men. "Hold this line or we lose everything," he told them. And they did. Machine guns were dragged by hand into new positions, their barrels smoking, their water jackets dented from shrapnel. Each burst of fire carved seconds of survival. The discipline that had seemed mechanical hours before now became salvation. The raiders fought almost blind. Muzzle flashes, screams, and the rhythm of the guns guiding them through the chaos. When dawn came, the slopes were silent, except for the crackle of burning grass. Nearly 700 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the ridge. The Marines had lost 80, with many more wounded, but the airfield still belonged to them. In the official reports, it was called the Battle of Edson's Ridge, but among those who survived, it became something else. Proof that preparation, discipline, and endurance could stop even the fiercest assault. The old M1917s, written off by some as relics, had fired almost continuously through the night. Some guns logged over 15,000 rounds. Their crews worked without rest, their uniforms soaked through, their hands burned from changing barrels. That night became the blueprint for every Pacific defense that followed. Pre-sighted guns, interlocking arcs, cool heads in the dark, and when later battles came, bigger, louder, and bloodier, the Marines would carry those lessons with them. On Edson's Ridge, They had learned that courage wasn't just charging forward. It was staying put, keeping the line steady while everything tried to shake it apart. Those who survived the ridge would soon find themselves in new campaigns. Tarawa, Tinian, Saipan, each time facing an enemy who believed spirit could overcome steel. But on Saipan, 2 years later, the scale would explode. The largest Banzai charge of the entire war would test every lesson learned on Guadalcanal. Every gun, every range card, every drop of water boiled into steam. And when it came, the outcome would echo across the Pacific. Saipan, July 7, 1944, the last great Banzai charge by dawn. The sky above Saipan was the color of ash. The previous night had been restless. Distant explosions, shouted orders, the constant metallic heartbeat of supply lines being rebuilt. Marines and soldiers from the 2nd and 27th Divisions lay exhausted in foxholes dug across the island's northern plain. Many had not slept for days. Unbeknownst to them, the remnants of the Japanese 43rd Infantry Division, nearly 4,000 men, had gathered in the shadows. General Saito, mortally wounded and unwilling to surrender, had ordered one last attack. Officers tore insignias from their uniforms, tied white hachimaki bands around their heads, and distributed every remaining rifle, grenade, and sword. Among them were wounded men on crutches, doctors, cooks, and even laborers. It was to be a collective death. At 04:30, the stillness shattered. Flares lit the horizon, and from the darkness rose the familiar chant. Tenno Heika Banzai! Thousands of voices merging into a single echoing roar. To the Marines, it sounded like the island itself had come alive. The first wave struck a narrow front held by elements of the 105th Infantry Regiment. They came in lines, bayonets fixed, their silhouettes visible in the growing light. The American perimeter bent, but did not break. Within seconds, the old weapons spoke again. Chasvans! Brownings, their barrels cooled overnight, opened up with mechanical precision. The deep, steady thump, thump, thump rolled across the plain like a drumbeat of steel. Water hissed into steam. Belts poured through the feed trays. Gunners swapped in fresh barrels, their hands blistered and blackened with soot. Everywhere, machine guns anchored the line. Marines who had fought at Guadalcanal and Tarawa now led green replacements, shouting range corrections over the deafening fire. "Keep it low, knee-height," one yelled. "Grazing fire! Keep it going!" The water-cooled Brownings sustained it hour after hour, refusing to melt or jam. Then came the 37 meat guns. Once designed to pierce light armor, they were now loaded with canister rounds, each shell containing over 120 steel balls. At 50 yards, the effect was apocalyptic. Whole ranks vanished in a haze of dust and smoke. Between the cannon fire and the continuous machine gun line, the charge dissolved into chaos. Japanese medics and rear elements joined the assault, driven by fatalism and desperation. Some carried satchel charges, hoping to destroy the guns. Few reached them. Browning crews fought on without pause, smoke coiling around the barrels like breath from a beast. Ammunition runners crawled through the carnage, dragging belts and cans through blood-soaked sand. For 2 hours, the plain became a furnace. The air shimmered from the heat of sustained automatic fire. Gunners could no longer hear commands, only feel the recoil, count their bursts, and feed the belts. The smell of oil, cordite, and seawater filled every breath. By 07, the attack was broken. The 105th Infantry's line held. Of the 4,000 Japanese who charged, barely 400 survived. The rest lay in overlapping ranks, their uniforms scorched, their weapons silent. It was the largest Banzai attack of the Pacific War. And the last. When the firing stopped, Marines emerged from the haze, faces blackened, hands raw. the old Brownings steaming beside them. Many guns had fired so long that their water had evaporated to sludge. Yet they still functioned. The weapons of another generation had done what no modern design yet could: deliver endless, uninterrupted fire against overwhelming numbers. Reporters and war correspondents later wrote of the obsolete guns that saved the perimeter. They were not glamorous, they were not new, but they worked, and in the Pacific, that was all that mattered. In the days that followed, engineers and ordnance officers examined the spent guns. Many barrels were warped, tripods dented, water jackets patched with tin or tape. But the internals, the heart of the machine, were intact. It was mechanical proof of endurance, a design that could outlast the battlefield itself. The Battle of Saipan ended the myth of the Banzai charge. Japan's army would never again launch such a massed assault. From that moment on, their defenses turned inward. Caves, tunnels, and strong points where courage could delay but not stop the inevitable. And for the Marines, it confirmed a truth learned on Edson's Ridge and written in blood across every island since. When the night comes, when the line trembles, when the world narrows to one field of fire, it isn't the newest weapon that saves you. It's the one that doesn't stop. When dawn rose fully over Saipan, the battlefield was a vision from another century. Twisted wreckage, smoke columns, and rows upon rows of bodies. Marines and soldiers moved through the plain in silence, rifles at the ready, though resistance had ended hours earlier. They found doctors, orderlies, and wounded Japanese officers lying side by side, many with grenades still in hand. The sheer scale of it stunned even veterans of Guadalcanal. The final count revealed what the guns had done. Over 4,000 Japanese dead in a single 3-hour assault. It was the costliest single attack Japan had launched in the Pacific, and the most decisive demonstration of American fire discipline. In the days that followed, reports circulated through the fleet and up the chain of command. War correspondents filed stories about machine guns from the last war, halting an army in minutes. Navy photographers captured the battered M19-117s surrounded by expended belts and smoking barrels. Commanders quietly noted that the same water-cooled designs had anchored their lines from Guadalcanal to Saipan without fail. The immediate consequence was doctrinal. U.S. planners, once eager to replace older weapons, began to reevaluate what obsolete really meant. The Marine Corps published new field notes on night defense, emphasizing fixed positions, overlapping fields of fire, and sustained automatic weapons. The lessons of the Ridge and the Plain were codified into procedure. Every company would train to establish final protective lines. Each gun team would practice water and ammo discipline as rigorously as marksmanship. Defensive plans would assume prolonged night attacks, with designated runners and reserves for each machine gun position. For the Marines on the ground, these were not abstractions. They had lived through the physics of endurance. Every man who'd served a Browning knew how long a belt lasted, how hot a barrel could glow before it warped, how far steam could hiss before the next refill. These small rituals of maintenance had become the difference between holding the line and being overrun. In post-battle evaluations, the Browning M1917 earned renewed respect from ordnance officers. Tests confirmed what the battlefield had already proven. It could sustain tens of thousands of rounds with minimal stoppages, and its cooling system functioned even under improvised conditions. The lighter, air-cooled M1919 remained valuable for mobility, but in static or defensive roles, the old water-cooled gun was irreplaceable. As replacement units landed on Saipan and Tinian, they inherited not only the terrain, but also the defensive philosophy born there. Engineers marked machine gun sites on new maps. Quartermasters stockpiled extra water cans beside ammo crates. and gunners traded stories about how the steam beasts had saved entire battalions. Yet for all the tactical pride, the emotional weight lingered. Many Marines wrote home not of victory, but of disbelief that so many had charged into certain death. The silence after the battle was heavier than the noise that had preceded it. "It wasn't fighting," one corporal wrote in his diary. "It was waiting for them to reach the line, and then stopping them from ever leaving it." In that uneasy quiet, the Corps confronted an unspoken truth. Technology had given them overwhelming power, but at a cost that defied comprehension. Each charge repelled was also a tragedy of belief. Courage, meeting machinery; conviction, meeting endurance. That moral tension would define the next stage of the war, when Japan abandoned open charges for fortresses underground, and the Americans turned their enduring guns toward the darkness of caves and tunnels. After Saipan, the Pacific War changed forever. The Japanese command, shocked by the annihilation of their last great assault, abandoned the doctrine of Gyokusai in large-scale form. No more mass Banzai charges, no more lines of men running into machine gun fire. Instead, they dug into ridges, into coral, into entire hills. Battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa would be fought not across open plains, but within labyrinths of concrete and stone. Yet even in those new environments, the old guns stayed. The M19-117, the Bar, and the 37mm followed the Marines from one volcanic island to the next. Their roles shifted, from perimeter defense to bunker suppression, from static guard to base security. In Iwo Jima's ash, the heavy Brownings guarded command posts and supply dumps, firing across ravines day and night. At Okinawa, they were mounted on jeeps and half-tracks, used to intercept infiltrators and sweep valleys. The Marine Corps, now seasoned by 3 years of Pacific warfare, had learned that modernity wasn't defined by invention alone. It was defined by function under pressure. Field reports noted that the water-cooled Brownings continued to deliver the highest sustained rate of fire under prolonged engagement. It was, by now, a 27-year-old design, but it kept working. American industry, meanwhile, pressed forward with newer technologies. The air-cooled M250 caliber, designed by the same John Browning, began to dominate heavier defensive roles. But its heritage was clear. Both guns shared the same mechanical DNA. Rugged, overbuilt, simple to maintain, impossible to stop. Marines called them machines with souls, half in jest, half in reverence. When the war ended in 1945, many of those same M19-117s were still in service. They had crossed from Guadalcanal to Saipan, from Tarawa to Okinawa, often repaired in the field with welding kits and scavenged parts. Their mounts were dented, their water jackets pitted from shrapnel. Yet their actions cycled as smoothly as the day they left the factory. After the surrender, ordnance teams collected thousands of them from the islands. Some were shipped home for refurbishment. Others were stored in depots, destined to be used again, in Korea, even Vietnam. The weapon that had fought the last great charges of the Pacific would later hold defensive lines at Chosin Reservoir and jungle bases along the Mekong. For historians, the irony was unavoidable. The very gun, designed for trench warfare in 1917, had defined the Pacific's jungle warfare of 1944. Its endurance bridged 2 eras, from mud and wire to coral and flame, to the men who served it. The Browning M19-017 was not nostalgia. It was survival. They remembered the hiss of its steam, the rhythm of its bolts, the way its sound became a heartbeat in the dark. Many would never forget the night on Saipan when its low, steady voice drowned out thousands of shouts. The M19-17 never sought glory. It simply refused to fail. And in war, that was glory enough. The Pacific would move on to new weapons, new machines, and a nuclear age that rendered old steel irrelevant. But in the memory of those who had faced the Banzai charges and survived, the lesson remained. The newest tool isn't always the best one. The best one is the one that never stops working. And that truth, born in mud, proven in coral, would outlast the war itself. The guns had spoken. The doctrine had shifted. Yet one question lingered, long after the smoke cleared. What did it mean that victory came not from innovation, but from endurance? War often rewards what endures, not what dazzles. In the Pacific, endurance was a steel machine built in 1917, a weapon forged for trenches yet reborn in jungles and coral plains. The Browning M19-117, with its steady rhythm and hissing steam, became more than hardware. It became proof that human discipline and mechanical reliability could outlast chaos itself. In the vast story of World War II, technology evolved at an impossible pace: jets, radar, atomic energy. Yet amid that revolution, some of the most decisive moments were shaped by tools designed decades earlier. The lesson was humbling, that progress is not linear, and that sometimes the old ways carry wisdom the new has not yet learned. For the Marines, those nights behind the Brownings were not just history. They were a meditation on control, on holding steady while the world screamed around them. Each pull of the trigger was a statement of order against madness, of calculation against despair. In that balance between chaos and composure lay the essence of modern warfare. After the war, when the Pacific fell silent, the M19-117s were crated up, cleaned, and stored. Some went to museums. Others waited quietly for another call. But their legacy endured not in steel, but in doctrine. In every machine gun range card, every overlapping field of fire, every young Marine taught that reliability wins battles long before courage does. The Japanese Banzai charge faded into history, but its echo remained, a cautionary sound about what happens when will collides with physics, when faith meets fire. The obsolete guns had not just stopped an army, they had ended an era. In the end, the Pacific Campaign's greatest irony was also its greatest truth. That victory belonged not to what was newest, but to what was certain. And sometimes, certainty comes from the past, in the steady rhythm of an old gun, firing through the night, until silence means survival.